The Art and Making of Penny Dreadful, the official companion book to the Showtime series, published in 2015, definitely should have had a more specific subtitle to denote the fact that this book only covers Season 1, so that's a very important thing to understand right out of the gate. And that there are no follow-up volumes for Season 2 or 3, which is a shame, though I suppose being abandoned and unresolved apparently comes with the territory of being a Penny Dreadful fan, though I am very, very happy to see an Art and Making of book for a TV show dedicated to just one season. Typically, we see multiple seasons crammed into one book, which is always unsatisfying. Add to that the fact that Season 1 of Penny Dreadful only includes 8 episodes, that sounds like it has the potential to be one of the best, most in-depth books ever made for a TV series. Unfortunately, it completely squanders that opportunity with its abysmal text. The images and design are a different matter, but we'll get to that later. For now, we'll just focus on the text. The book's about 175 pages, which isn't bad per se, but uncomfortably close to being the bare minimum. Add to that the text only accounts for about maybe 35% of the book, which as a text-to-image ratio is fine, but this all means that there is a lot of pressure on the text to get maximum value out of what little there is, considering how much has to be covered. So every sentence has to have purpose and value, but this is not something the book is concerned with at all. 75% of the text in this book is grossly inadequate, insipid, pointless fat and filler, taking up the overwhelming majority of what relatively little space is afforded to the text. Now, that does mean 25% of the text is good and worthy and interesting, which, even in such a small quantity, is still always important and potentially rewarding of, depending on how big of a fan you are. You will learn some really cool, insightful stuff and get a certain amount of joy from parts of the text. It's just that the overwhelming majority of it is frustratingly bad, and because you're oscillating between large amounts of trash and small piles of treasure, the overall reading experience is still unpleasant and unengaging despite the good parts. Likewise, the overall impression is tarnished when you're constantly feeling disappointed by what a wasted opportunity the majority of the text is, when there's no need for it to be this way except that the author is completely inept. The inept author in question is Sharon Gosling, who has written several behind-the-scenes books for movies and TV shows. I've never read any of her other work, so I'm going to give her the benefit of the doubt and assume that the failure of this book represents an anomaly, though not for her benefit but for mine, so I can attempt to rationalize how she's been allowed to write so many making-of books when, based solely on this one, she comes across as a hack who has no idea what she's doing and no business writing a book like this. So the way the information is presented is in 2 to 6 page sections, with each of those sections focusing on a character or locational scene, which as an approach sounds good in theory. At least it's not trying to do that stupid thing most movie making of books do of organizing everything by department. At least this way, by focusing on a specific character or specific location, we should be able to get specific, detailed, in-depth information and anecdotes. But no. On the back of the book, it claims to dissect every aspect of the production, and that it is an in-depth look into the making of the series. These aren't even exaggerations, they're just blatant lies. This is one of the least in-depth behind-the-scenes books I've ever come across. We've already established that the text doesn't have that much space anyway, so everything just flies by. It is an incredibly and disappointingly short read, but even within that, the text itself is so shallow, so generalized and mundane. There is too little in the way of detail and specificity and meaningful or entertaining behind-the-scenes information as far as the majority goes. The author and the quoted cast and crew spend most of it on things like praising one another, telling you how brilliant everyone is, telling you about the characters and story as if you're too stupid to understand the show you've already watched. Even when technically talking about the making of the show, it's usually basic, obvious generalizations and frivolous sound bites that offer no actual insight into the making of the show. That the quotes are this shallow and unavailing for a book that only covers 8 episodes is inexcusable. I'll give an example. When discussing the creation of the vampires, it's like, so John Logan, the showrunner, knew how he wanted them to move. We're not told how or why. So then we read the script and did some sketches, and then John and the director would tell us what they did and didn't like, and we'd refine it until we hit on a design they approved. I swear I'm not dumbing that down. That takes up about half a page, and there is no more detail than what I've just said. As if anyone with no film or television production knowledge couldn't just work that out and assume that's the process for creature design for any production. There's no mention of anything specific to the creation of the vampires for this show. Nothing about what those things were that they did and didn't like, no mention of specific inspirations, alternate ideas, rationale behind the designs, nothing. And creature design and prosthetics actually represents one of the better covered areas in this book. The shooting gets next to nothing, costumes get next to nothing. Actually, there's no point listing all these because everything gets next to nothing. The only exception being set design, which makes up the vast majority of the text's focus in this book, both good and bad. That really sums up what this is in terms of a behind-the-scenes book. Set design with some other areas sprinkled in here and there. Not sure I'd call that a dissection of every aspect of the production. Similarly, beyond the information being organized into the very small specific entries, the structure and particularly flow of the book is almost non-existent. It feels very scattered and random, with absolutely no flow, which also makes for a really poor reading experience. I cannot overstate how much this book would have benefited from being organized episode by episode, which to me seems like the most obvious and intuitive way to do a TV series book anyway, and it would have forced, or at least lent itself, to more specific, detailed information, though that could only help so much as it would also require that the quotes be better chosen and not the same sort of drivel we have here. In the very roughest sense, the book already does kind of follow the episodes, with scenes and locations being somewhat organized in sequence, but even then, not always and never in a meaningful way. Some of the longer stretches of the good, proper text in the book are when a specific scene is being discussed, and those are also the times when it's just so clear that the book should have been structured by episode and by scene. Because there are some sections that are the opposite of everything I've mentioned and are great. For example, the pages on the British Museum, the seance scene, the rat baiting, which, despite being one of the more unpleasant scenes in the show, it and those other two are almost entirely made up of specific, practical, interesting behind-the-scenes insights and anecdotes, still all too short to be truly in-depth given the space constraints, but if every section in the book had been like these, it would have been fantastic. Unfortunately, they represent only a handful of such cases. More entries are either completely or mostly worthless, while the majority are basically just very hit and miss with how much actual information they contain. One area of the text that sort of falls in between is that there's quite a bit about Victorian history and culture. Now, this is genuinely interesting information that is relevant to the context of the show. However, in this case, it's a very unwise inclusion that feels like filler taking up space that really should have been given to making of information, since that's what the book is about, yet is already struggling with. So the text aside, there are some things the book does really well. The images are great, to the point that I genuinely learned more about the making of the show through looking at the images than I did from the text, with the exception of way too many stills from the show, which is always a ridiculous inclusion, but doubly so in this case where they're taking up such vital space of the book's insubstantial page count. But thankfully those are outweighed by images of wonderful quality, quantity, and variety. It's got behind-the-scenes pictures of prosthetics, detailed set photography, before and after visual effects pictures, graphic design work like the posters and signage around London, storyboards, and of course concept art. Though I will say, if you have come to this book attracted by the art promised in the title, do pay close attention to the flip through just so you know how much and what kind to expect. Also, it probably goes without saying at this stage, but there's basically no discussion of the artworks or their creation and impact. The area this book gets top marks is for the design. Inside and out, it's outstanding. Time and skill have been put in to give it a highly designed look that reflects the show's aesthetic. It's always a marvelous touch when a book can pull that off. Lots of well-chosen little graphic design details, page color, stains, etc. Even the blood red map of London used for the end papers, stunning and astute, which really contributes to the idea of the book being a great physical keepsake for fans, because it feels like effort has been put into tailoring something special and specific to this show. But most important is how it almost perfectly marries form and function, and allows for a decent quantity of images while still looking beautiful, a very difficult thing to do. Sadly, although it's absolutely worth praise and admiration, great design doesn't really count for much when the text is so underwhelming. The other reason this book's so disappointing is because I was really hoping it would make up for the equally atrocious behind-the-scenes features on the Season 1 DVD. They're very similar to this book actually, not only because they suffer from essentially the exact same problems, but even some of the exact same quotes are repeated. Likewise, some of the behind-the-scenes images in the book are just stills from the video footage shown. The book certainly does cover more stuff and better than the DVD, but you can see all those DVD featurettes and more on the Penny Dreadful YouTube channel. At least that way you're being disappointed for free, as opposed to the book where you're having to pay for the privilege. Penny Dreadful. More like $40 dreadful. As ever though, it's not the time and money wasted that's the real issue, it's that the one and only opportunity there will ever be to make a great book for the show was completely blown by some hack writer who is incapable or uninterested of doing her job properly. And then, to really rub salt into the wound, on the very last page in her acknowledgements section, she hits us with this. In truth, I could have written an entire volume for every episode. Such was the detail every interview provided. In the end, I just couldn't fit everything into the pages we had available. Are you serious? had so much detail that she could fill a book for every episode and didn't have space in this one, yet has enough space to fill most of it with poorly chosen garbage that lacks detail. How can you have the gall to taunt your reader like this after what you've just offered up? That clowns like this are allowed to write these books is just friggin' ludicrous.